So let's make that transition from Plato to Malthus. And just a couple ideas that jump out at me when I look at Plato. Again, the guardian class is going to rig a system. It involves ceremonies and so forth. But the idea is there has to be someone deciding how the right people are procreating together. So you want the best with the best, and the idea is to form the perfect state. So it's Plato's very fascistic, and one of the features would be that there'd have to be hard compliance to the state, to the point of the state deciding how you're going to reproduce. So that's a lot of compliance. So when I talk about um, the biopolitics of the New World Order, or the esoteric biopolitics of the New World Order, instruction, compliance, resistance is hard on the compliance side, and control. And one point that's interesting, that it says that, of course, inferior children will be relegated to living in that class of people. Um, Doctors, because we talked about on the top of the pyramid who's guarding the guardians and so forth, the true hidden hand. Are they wild men? Doctors may conceal the truth from their patients, but patients should conceal nothing from their doctors. Um, Doctors control, taking on both the position of priest, rabbi, and lawyer. So think about the power of that when we talk about the biopolitics of controlling this is, for me, is spiritual. So this is why I call it esoteric biopolitics, because the body and the mind are a means to the soul. So that's what the real battlefield is about here. So doctors may conceal the truth from the patients. It's a one-sided relationship, and the doctors, of course, are the state, and that's biopolitics, and that's what Foucault's talking about. And so that's the nut of control. And if the doctors are beyond good and evil, they can lie to you, they can deceive you, and the system deceives you. So how can it be so he's talking about this perfect system, but it's based on a lie, and it's based on manipulating perception. Superior offspring, superior women with superior men, the ideal population. And it's funny, the New World Order and this infinite federations of society use this as a blueprint. But for Plato, the perfect size of a society would be 5,000 people. And it would be interesting for people to explore how, whether or not we're moving into a world of, um, stack, like stack cities, and those trends with globalism, if there'd be a subculture of people that would live outside of the megacities and communities of about 5,000. Thomas Malthus, British clergyman, published an essay on the principles of population. And you can't have this narrative of population control and eugenics and so forth without talking about Malthus, because they like this guy a lot. They're his guy, even though his predictive his level of prediction, if that's any level of a social scientist or a clergyman, he's batting about zero. So I don't know why, but he is. That word, they like Malthusian. They like that word. They're comfortable with it because it's not science. They don't need science. It's the Okay. He argued that populations, when unchecked, increased in a geometric ratio. Proof false. Over and over. That's positive checks: disease, wars, famine, genocide, preventive checks. So he's thinking somehow something's dangerous that's going on in the early 19th century, that society has become too soft, and people have to some. There's too much peace in the world. There's a clergyman, of course. There's too much peace in the world. These natural checks are wearing out. We're going to get these larger families. The poor people are reproducing family. So it's Platonic. We don't want these plebs around. So the good people are not reproduced. And this is a conversation going on in the world today. And I'm not saying it doesn't have value. But in light of certain policy directions, it's a pretty dangerous idea. So he thought, the world was going to hell in a handbasket because all these poor people were going to control, overpopulate the world. And he fudged the numbers. That's been clearly demonstrated. I think one text I looked at recently was Darwin and the New World Order, and he cited a number of texts where they're just crazy numbers and built from crazy assumptions. But what he wanted, his vision of the world, is no support for so these churches that were getting soft and giving these poor shelters or aid. He thought that they should be eliminated. And you'd get to this, in the Victorian age with that age of Malthusians and William Graham Sumner that say, the pigeons are going to come back if you keep feeding them, and to the modern conservative arguments that any kind of at least government solution is going to create its secondary and tertiary problems. He's kind of arguing that even about the church. They're just not even worth supporting by anybody. So even if the Bible says over and over and over and over and over, he's a clergyman telling you, don't do it for reasons of social science. This is the beginning of what Foucault and Agamben would call the beginning of this biopolitical era, with the rise of the control of these new methods of population control and a science or pseudoscience behind them. So Malthus is the backbone of this new narrative of biopolitics. It's not built on any science. And it's not very biblical. You might have heard this one before. This is his idea of public policy. And he is the pinup guy for all the population bombers, from the 1970s and 80s. We should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality, and if we dread to frequent visitations of horrid form of famine. I don't know what he said. That was pretty boring, but let's get into the bold part here. We should seditiously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use, instead of recommending cleanliness. Of course, this is the state now existing like it's there to take care of you in this new modern form. And we're about to have the rise of what would be called bureaucracies, agencies dedicated to taking care of people. But this is still church policy and recommendations for how the state to some extent should assist the poor, that in this new transition to a manufacturing society was producing displacement and urbanizations and all the problems associated with it. So he's saying, don't recommend cleanliness to the poor. We should encourage contrary habits. Go get dirty. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. I mean, this is wild. And, this is, nobody denies it. He said this, and this is his idea of what public policy, what William Graham Sumner from over there at Columbia in the late 19th century would almost just echo exactly. He's unabashedly Malthusian in how to take care of the poor. But he's not talking about ignoring them. He's talking about weaponizing cities, narrow streets that would actually produce these conditions. And we can think about the oligarchs through their instruments of government and urban development of the 50s and 60s, and that these packed conditions that many displaced people found themselves into would be very much a system of I don't neo enslavement; those are kind of meaningless terms, but it was a definitely a Malthusian, I think, in terms of its regard for these people. Uh, in our towns, we should make the streets narrow, crowd more people into the houses. And I lived in New York City for 18 years and actually was brainwashed into thinking that that was kind of cool to be all packed into a city. Um, but I'm over it. But that's Malthus's idea of weaponizing a city. Pack them together. You know, look at the population of Tokyo or Mexico City or these new cities of China, and that's definitely the next wave of this movement toward this neo feudal world arrangement will be. But I don't think there's going to be a class of wild men, I guess, that don't necessarily want to do this all the time. In the contrary, we should build our villages near stagnant pools. So that's what we'll pack them into the city. But if not, we'll um, stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases. So, um, again, biopolitics as planning, this sounds like it's beyond weaponizing a city. He wants to poison these people and make it look like it's natural. So it's kind of a sick individual. Um, but I think that's the draconian kind of view you arrive with when you take Plato's fascistic ideas seriously and mix in, a bit of Machiavelli and Darwin, and that's the kind of thinking you're going to come up with. And of course, he comes around before Darwin, but he was very much connected with the ideas of Darwin's grandfather and the Lunar Society and their Rosicrucian Creed. Um, so yeah, Malthus, from Plato to Malthus, and then what we essentially get are neo-Malthusians. Because of course, when it's a bankrupt theory to begin with, like evolution, you always have to come up with another uh, innovation upon a variation um, to sell that thing. So join me on the other side, and we'll discuss a little bit more about man and his destiny on the world, why we're being controlled, and to what ends.